Welcome to the start of this panel. Sorry for the slight delay, everybody. Felicita Medved, who's with the supporters of this session, is going to just make a short introduction and tell us a little bit more about the foundation and why this panel is so important.
Thank you. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear liberal friends, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the European Liberal Forum, I'm really delighted to welcome you to this event, the Ralph Dahrendorf Roundtable, which is organized to discuss, debate, and preferably also to point out some of the possible solutions to the Ukraine crisis and the future of the Ukraine. European Liberal Forum is a political foundation on European level, and we comprise about 40 think tanks, institutes, and political foundations in almost all member states of the European Union. We promote active citizenship and also stimulate research and debate on EU policy issues with the aim to reach both decision makers as well as the citizen. This roundtable, discussing Ukraine and its critical moment, indeed an urgent moment, gives us an opportunity to discuss the issues that concern also the matters that are very close to the heart of the European Liberal Forum. Some would argue that we live again in Cold War, that we are back to the Cold War times. And some would say that hot war is feasible. If this is so, what should we do? Today's news tell us that Russia might invade parts of Ukraine. On the other hand, that West wants to seize control and that new sanctions might be imposed. European Union, I was taught, and I still strongly believe, is a project of peace. It was born as a project of peace. It is the winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace. And it is all about the force of law and not the law of force. I believe that we as liberals should continue, as Lord Dahrendorf, to which this roundtable is also connected in name, promote European Union as a guarantor for human rights and liberty within the EU as well as beyond. And before I give word to the President of the Liberal International and to discussants of this round table, allow me please first to thank Liberal International, then our member organizations, the VVD International, as well as Friedrich Naumann Stiftung für die Freiheit, for organizing this event. And just one sentence, which is my personal note, coming from a country, being born in a country of former Yugoslavia, and experienced the painful breakout up of this country, my thoughts go to the people of the Ukraine, that they would be able, peacefully and in dignity, to be the creators of their own destiny. Thank you, and please, Hans, if you can take the floor.
Thank you, Felicita, for the introduction and making it happen, this panel, because I think it's of vital importance that we debate the situation in Ukraine and in Russia. I must say that I have been outspoken, as has been Guy Verhofstadt and many others, on the fact that what has happened in the Crimea is breaking international law. Is that. And even much more than that, it's an end to the Helsinki process in which was said between East and West that borders should be borders, should not be changed, apart from if you have consensus and under international law, such as Czechoslovakia split in a very democratic way. So what Putin has done, he jeopardizes peace in Europe. You see in the media, strangely enough, when we were at Maidan to support the peaceful and democratic people who were there demonstrating, that there is a spin by the Russians. So they say on Maidan they're all fascists. Opinion polls prove that the ultra-right wing will have a few percentage in democratic elections, not more than that. So what Russia says is not true at all. If you then see that even the Western media, again, accept that Russia has legitimate interest in Ukraine, think that the Dutch government would say, we have a legitimate stake in Belgian affairs. Because a majority of the people in Belgium speak Dutch, they're ruled by a prime minister who speaks French, and that we can intervene. Then you see little soldiers without insignia, and we would say, no, that's not us. But when they are in Brussels, they have to ask, where is the railway station? Because they would know, so they're not from Brussels. And it's swallowed. It's swallowed. The moment when I was at Maidan, also the Dutch press said, he provoked Russian intervention. Well, I have dear Liberal International, but Liberal International cannot provoke military intervention wherever in the world. It's the same like Ortega said, the president of Liberal International wanted to stage a coup d'etat, a military coup, in Nicaragua. I'm not the kind of person who doesn't like to be seen in the media, to be honest, but this is not true. So also the president of Liberal International has not provoked the annexation of the Crimea and will not provoke actions, illegitimate actions in eastern Ukraine. Again, it's good to have this workshop. It's good also that the ambassador, Alexander Horin from Ukraine, is here, so we have direct information. I wish you not only a pleasant, but a very informative meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those words, Hans, very wise words, and it's nice to know that you're not the cause of all the trouble in Ukraine at the moment, as much as President Putin might like to make it out. Well, we're going to start off with Han ten Broeke, who's going to speak to us from the VVD party here, and our host here today, and perhaps to talk about your experiences at the moment.
Sure. You want me to go over there?
Please.
Let me first say thank you for giving me the floor, how relieved I am that Hans is not going to get us into trouble in foreign countries anymore. Because first and foremost, I would like him to stay alive because we also have to win another election on the 22nd of May. Secondly, I care for him, and I think we all do. And in him, we have an honorary president, and as I understood, this will be a function for the rest of his life. So congratulations to you on that, Hans. You asked me to sum up some of the lessons learned. I'm a fan of Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger said once that the test of foreign policy in conflict is how it ends, not how it begins. And, well, I don't know where we stand at the moment, but it might be a little bit early to already come up with lessons learned. Still, I will give it a chance. I think a very important moment went down in history when we saw at the end of February of this year the mediation process of the Troika, the three ministers of foreign affairs, Fabius, Steinmeier and Sikorsky, coming up with a deal in Kiev. And I think that was a foreign policy success. Let us also say that for once, because foreign policy failures, we've seen a lot from the EU, but this was a foreign policy success. It immediately triggered the ousting of Yanukovych. And I think it was unfortunately not followed up with what could have been another success. If the three ministers of foreign affairs would have just imagined that they would have flown on to Moscow, where Putin was, he hadn't even arrived because he was still in this Sochi extravaganza party called the Winter Olympics. But just imagine what would have happened if they would have flown on to Moscow and simply taken care of some of the considerations on the Russian side that we now deem, unfortunately, unjust or unjustified. I think we could have been in another situation right now. I think we could have maybe prompted a real referendum for the Crimea. And maybe we should have talked, which will happen and is happening, certain forms of autonomy for the eastern Ukraine. It didn't happen, however. So I think that was not it was foreign policy naivety not to do that. And I think Henry Kissinger wrote a very good piece on that in the Washington Times. Are we being too soft? Which is a question that is being asked constantly. Are we the appeasers of our time? Maybe we are, to a certain extent, but I don't think this is 1939. The world is much more intertwined. Russia isn't Germany. The power base of Putin also rests on economy, on his own economy, which is basically an oil-driven economy. Russia is like Saudi Arabia, but with nuclear arms. Putin isn't trying to proliferate communist ideology. What he's trying to do is he's a revanchist. He wants to have the great Russia back again. And his idea with the Eurasian Union as a counterproduct to the European Union fell to pieces when Kiev chose for democracy and a decent life. And for him, then, Ukraine or Kiev, the jewel in his crown was nicked away. And I think sometimes it is good that we also try to imagine what the motivation is of the guy on the other side. Because I don't think with Putin we have a second Gaddafi. He's not a mad dog. He might be paranoid. Martha Geshen wrote a fantastic book on him, The Man Without a Face. I recommend it to all of you. He's a calculating man. And he knows that with his land grab under the cloak of protecting Russian minorities, he can get away with it. And he can get away with it because we let him. And to be quite fair and honest, whoever would like to put up his hand here today and say that we would turn this into a military conflict and send soldiers for what might be a good cause, but I don't think many of us would do. And we've seen this in 2008 in Georgia, with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And now we see it again in eastern Ukraine, and we've already seen it in Crimea. Putin regards us, the West, as weak, corrupt, and hypocrite. And to a certain extent, he could be right. So he taunts international rules, defies them. But here's one thing he can't defy. He cannot defy the laws of gravity of the financial markets. And he cannot, in essence, deny global economy. Today, Standard & Poor's downgraded Russian economy to a notch up from junk status. Capital flows out, interest rates go up, stock markets implode, and the ruble is down. Now, I'm not saying that this will tilt Russia at this moment towards a position that they're more predisposed to what we have to say. Their pain threshold, I'm quite sure, is higher than ours. But the G7 just this afternoon announced new sanctions. I'm not quite sure what they will hold. Maybe sanctions towards specific companies. The EU ministers will hold an emergency meeting, I hear. But as I said, essentially Russia is an oil and gas economy, so we can hurt them. 80% of Russian gas flows into the EU. Many of the EU member states are completely depending on gas and oil from Russia. Half of Russian budget is financed with oil and gas. So yes, we can hurt them, but we need to be strong and willing to do so. But who of Western politicians is capable and willing to, at this moment where we see a slight economic recovery, put down that economic recovery and put it on the brink for the principles that we all share? For the Dutch economy, I will be fair and honest, it will be affected. We have huge agricultural exports, machinery. For the French, it will be weapons or ships or defense products. For the Brits, it's the financial sector, and so there's more countries that have the same contemplations. It's only the US that can do this at the moment. I will, however, end with an optimistic note, because I think there's 3 lessons for the not immediate future, but the intermediate future. And these are 3 good lessons, 3 lessons that we hold dear as liberals. I think European foreign politics can get a boost out of this, but we need to understand that European foreign politics is also foreign border politics. We see this now with the Ukraine. We need to make sure that it will never get to the Baltics. And yes, this is also the year where the Dayton Accords either expire or are going to be prolonged, and that is a potential conflict within our borders. Then secondly, yes, we need common energy policy. Everybody knows that. I think it is important that if we can have the US export its LNGs, liquefied natural gas, and if I could take you in a bus 2 kilometers from here, we have a gas terminal that could actually make use of that and make it stream throughout Europe and even back to the Ukraine. Then we, making use of that possibility, together with the fact that we are going into the summer and we have strategic reserves, could within a year not be completely energy independent. That's still a dream, but we could get quite far and hurt the oil and gas economy of the Russians. And lastly, my party leader in the House, the floor leader in the House, Halbe Zijlstra, said it yesterday during the opening of this conference, we cannot allow to further downgrade and economize on our military budgets. We should now realize that we need a strong military, not just a strong economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Han. I think very honest, straightforward assessment of the current situation, which is also constantly changing and of which no one quite knows the future yet or what the solutions will be. And I think this is a good opportunity to welcome His Excellency Alexander Horen to the stage to talk about matters from the Ukrainian perspective. And I should point out that Mr. Horen is from the Donetsk region, which is currently very much in the spotlight in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. I really appreciate the efforts of Hans van Baalen for bringing me and giving an opportunity to speak. To return to the time when Ukraine was part of the United Europe, as it was in the 12th century, so probably not everybody knows that Ukraine was a European country much earlier than some modern European countries who are now exist, and one of the Ukrainian princesses was even Queen of France. But when we are speaking about Ukraine and the present situation, we should understand why Putin moved and is doing what he is doing. This is a very interesting question, and I think if we understand it correctly, we will find these points of influence and the possibility to influence him and to make, if you like, more harm to the position which he occupies now. Ideology of Putin is the reconstruction of the Soviet Union. The goal, the ideology is united Soviet Union, because once he said that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century was the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So there were no 2 world wars, there were no Holocaust, there were no atomic bombing and so forth, but the disintegration of the Soviet Union. So at this moment, he felt that his idea is within reach, but at the same time, I think he feels and he felt that two very strong pillars of him is not very solid. The first one is the military industrial complex of the Russian Federation and Russian strategic nuclear forces. Probably it's not a secret for you, but at this moment 42% of Russian ICBMs are serviced by Ukrainian designer bureau Yuzhne. And all these missiles, which is called Voyevoda in Russian terms, are Ukrainian-built SS-18 Saturns. So the Russian Bulavas are not flying. Voyevodas needs to be served. They can be served only by designer bureau. Designer bureau is in Ukraine. The easiest way to resolve this issue, to resolve it by incorporating in something which will be called the customs union or something else. The second pillar, which is very serious for Putin, is Russian Orthodox Church. But with this movement towards Europe, Ukrainian Orthodox Church is asking for independence. But to leave Ukrainian Church to go means to lose 38% of the revenues of the church, which is, to my mind, a little bit unacceptable for him. So that is why these factors brought in one place, in one time, and this time was Mr. Yanukovych's presidency, when everything was thought to be resolved through Yanukovych, all this incorporation in the Soviet Union finally was ruined. Ruined by Ukrainian people, by protests in Ukraine. As a result, and if we see the genesis of development of the situation, you will see that Ukrainian authorities made a move which was anti-democratic, and the reaction of European Union was the doors are open. And this was very bad for Putin. Why? Because he thought that after beating on the 30th of November and after decline to sign association agreement, reaction of European Union will be the following one. So go and join Mr. Lukashenko. And Mr. Yanukovych will not have any other choice as to become the part of this customs union, to be in one place in the reconstructed Soviet Union. So I think it was the plan. But after any move, there was doors are open, doors are open, doors are open. So Europe finally recognized that the Putin is a threat. And without Ukraine, Putin will never become emperor, or sorry, the president of the Soviet Union or something like that. But in this moment, something dramatic should happen. And what have happened in Ukraine was the real situation when the people simply has made their choice. But this choice didn't satisfy Russian Federation. And it's unnerved President Putin. He needed, in order to prove himself as a leader, something which will be very, very victorious. And the campaign in Crimea was just what have happened. In order to prove himself as a leader, in order to show that he is in charge and he is in control, and immediately after the events in Crimea and annexation of Crimea, the ratings of Putin went high, and now, if I'm not mistaken, are at the level of 90%, which is a very rare occasion for the president who is staying the third term in power. So in this case, it seems to me the forceful scenario was a kind, and some of Putin's politologists say, okay, it was the decision taken by him, and he recognized that he was taking this decision on the basis of so-called clandestine poll in Crimea. So I would like to use allegory of Hans van Balen and say, if, for example, the Dutch will have this clandestine pole in Flandria, in Belgium, and then decide to move in, what will be the reaction of? So it seems to me that the situation was used by Putin. He miscalculated the reaction of the European Union, of the United States of America, and finally, at this moment, he has no reasonable choice what to do. If you ask me what's going on further, I will tell you I don't know. Because in this situation, he is using the chess terminology in Zugzwang. Any next move is worsening his position. 2 words about violation of international law. We are in a unique situation. The country and leader has violated everything. He violated bilateral agreements, and he violated the so-called imperative norms of international law, which you can find in the Charter of the United Nations or in the Helsinki Principles. And the thing when he said, okay, we didn't violate Memorandum of Budapest, by phrase that we didn't threaten Ukraine is with nuclear arms, even more shows that he is out of the reality of the present situation. So what can be done? I think that, and this was the question, what can be done by Europe? Sanctions is one way, but sanctions are not enough. Why? Because sanctions, if you like, temporary measures. We need to use measures which will make it impossible to Ukraine to become one more target. This can be done through engagement, incorporating Ukraine into Europe, but incorporating not as somebody who is coming and begging to get something, but using Ukraine's potential. I return back to these intercontinental ballistic missiles. Do you know that Designer Bureau Yuzhne has more launches than NASA altogether? So this is the company which can provide Europe with the most sophisticated and most successful the rocket boosters, and we can make development, the European space exploration much better than they are at this moment and less expensive. Or, for example, you are aware of A400 military transport medium-range aircraft, which here is on paper. In Ukraine, it's in flying. So in other words, to return to the idea of 2002, when NATO wanted to make this plane the basic for NATO, it will save money here, and it will engage Ukraine into the system. And it will make it impossible for Russia to think about the renewal of the military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union. By the way, when Prime Minister Azarov announced that Ukraine is not going to sign association agreement, there was a delegation led by Mr. Rogozin, who visited 3 regions of Ukraine and visited 5 former military-industrial complex enterprises, among them 2 rocket building, one which is producing the engines for all the Russian Navy, one which is producing the most sophisticated radars, and Turboatom, one of the leaders in the world building of the nuclear power. So you see, here is the points which European Union can help Ukraine to resolve by engaging Ukraine into activities. So I will at this moment finish. If there are any questions, I'm ready then to try to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And we will do some questions at the end. And I think it's clear there that Ukraine has much to offer to Europe in terms of its revigorating its industries. I think now we've looked at Putin and the bigger question, the mystery of Putin, and no doubt we'll come back to him. But a lady here from the Center for Civil Liberties, Alisa Novichkova, and perhaps a little view on the Maidan and human rights issues on the ground and the energy that's caused these changes in Ukraine.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the honor to speak to you about the issue with the human rights and the whole Maidan situation. So, if we're speaking about human rights, we speak about several stages of the awareness of the human rights. And if we have a brief look on the history of the Maidan, we can see that it started with the refusing to sign an agreement by the authorities of Ukraine, and people went out to the streets, mostly students, and we call it like the first stage, the students' Euromaidan. And then there were a violent crackdown on the early morning of 30th of November, and on the 1st of December, like thousands of people went out to Maidan. They went to Maidan from other cities, from other parts of Ukraine, and they came there not to express their disagreement about not signing the agreement. They came out so their children haven't been beaten again by the police forces. The main reason wasn't about the Europe, not about the custody alliance. It was about human rights, a freedom for expression, a freedom for gathering, a freedom for being a citizenship, not being an object of the political process in the country. So the second wave was after the so-called laws of 16th of January. And the laws of 16th of January were laws against freedom of speech, liberty of gathering, and a lot of other liberties, as, for example, publishing and making NGOs, etc., etc. So people went out more numerous on the streets, so they want to live in a free country and not to be like the second totalitarian regime. So as a response, there were thrown the first Molotov cocktails because there were no peaceful methods to oppose the government. So people became criminals because they don't have any legal means to voice their opinion. And then were a lot of violences. Water cannons at -15, beaten up in the middle of the arrestation and checking in the police station, abduction, forced disappearance, tortures, etc., etc. So a human rights violation, you name it, I give you an example. And nobody called it revolution. It was Euromaidan. But it's like, when was the first stage of Euromaidan? On the 18th, 20th of February. Me personally, I was out of the country and I returned on the 21st of February after all the shootings. And I returned to a completely new country. The level of solidarity which started to form during the first stages of Euromaidan, it goes sky high. So people were solidary. Like small examples, during these protests, there were formatted 3 hospitals, 3 full-scale hospitals with the operational rooms, with the heart reanimations, with the lung ventilations machine. Everything was donated or bought on the donations. Myself, I was responsible for the volunteers on the hotline. I was coordinating hotline of Euromaidan SOS. It's a certain hub between those who need a lawyer and those who can help lawyers. And not like in Russia, we have 450 lawyers all working on volunteering basis. It's not the new initiative, so we based on the Bolotnaya case, but the level of solidarity was different, so that's why we were more successful. So the first point, what Ukraine learned during, and the most important, that's solidarity. The second was, I'm going to speak, it's about the situation in Crimea. The situation in Crimea is really desperate for us as human rights defenders in the meaning of defense of human rights, because there is no legal mechanism. During the protests on Euromaidan, we had at least certain mechanism. We have deputies willing to assist. We have like the aids of the High Representative on human rights in Supreme Council. So people who can access, who can help, and they were willing to help. In Crimea, we have even problems with the monitoring of human rights processing and human rights violations. And in the sensitive territories, as you know, yesterday it was forcibly disappeared 13 persons. Among them were like 7 observers from OSCE. And that's a huge problem. But people still optimistic, and they're still willing to struggle for their rights. So, and the question is that I was in European Parliament, I was asked a question, what is the difference between Ukraine and the other conflict zones? That, for example, that was a conflict between Georgia and Russia. We have Libya and Venezuela and other countries. What's the difference? And like, there are maybe 2 answers. The first one, we're very close to Europe. So we have a direct border with the European Union. And the second, that Ukraine has a lot of things, as the ambassador has stated, to offer. For example, the famous sea launch. And it's really important because right now Russia has monopoly for space traveling. And what I would like, what are the solution actually, with all the forced disappearance of the missions and journalists, etc., and with the whole like seeming ineffectiveness of the sanctions, what we have learned, the second thing, that during this Euromaidan process, that it's worth it to continue trying, because you never know which drop will be the last. And if we're speaking about human rights defendants, and if we're speaking of human rights, and human rights is the principal value for liberals, I think what is important is to continue to do what you believe in, and not saying, okay, we can't do anymore. So we withdraw sanctions, we withdraw any attempts, and I can assure you that Ukrainian level of solidarity is really high. And if we have a little bit of help, with this assistance, we can do things. And I would like to finish my presentation with the slogan we have invented during the Euromaidan actions, that human rights come the first. And that's why I'm pretty optimistic, and I do ask you, don't become desperate that it seems that sanctions doesn't work and that there is still a room for Russian aggression and military aggression in Ukraine. But let's do what we believe in, and human rights comes the first. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alyssa, for those moving words, and I think that really represents the spirit that's caused this current new revolution. And now I'd like to hear from Sergei Mitrokhin of the Russian United Democrat Party. And I think what will be particularly interesting, given Alyssa's words about Crimea and the worsening human rights situation, is to know what the human rights are like in Russia and the work that your party is doing.
Good afternoon, dear liberal friends. If we want to better understand Russia's policies toward Ukraine, we have to be aware of some important motives and incentives behind Vladimir Putin's actions. I could say the main incentive is to keep his power for long life. It is the main motive of Putin. Vladimir Putin received an oligarchic economy as Boris Yeltsin's legacy, and in the past 14 years built on this basis his own system of political domination, and he is the key and indispensable element of this system. Putin connects his perspectives only with the existence of this system and only as its head. All of Russia's economic and political elite, extracting their huge profits out of the oligarchic economy and at the expense of the rest of the population of Russia, make their plans accordingly. The Russian elite realizes that it can lose all its reach if Vladimir Putin retreats from power. Such a threat became real in other countries, where from time to time orange revolutions sweep off the political regimes similar to that formed under Putin. The fear of an orange revolution phantom has been the main driving force in the evolution of the regime since 2004, when the first such revolution occurred in Ukraine. It was followed by the Arab Spring and now by a new revolution in Ukraine, which is much more radical. Mass rallies in Moscow 2011-2012 showed that such scenarios are very real for Russia too. Therefore, during all these 10 years, the Kremlin has been developing a program of preventive measures that would preempt the regime change. This program included, in the first place, toughening of reprisals against the opposition, adoption draconian laws against the civil society and human rights, curbing of civil rights and freedoms, demolishing of democratic institutions. However, quite soon, this policy came into conflict with the Western vector of development, which Russia, despite all mistakes and jokes, maintained throughout the 90s. Hence, the regime made a sharp ideological turn towards the anti-Western vector and, respectively, confrontation with the West. The Western vector of development did not satisfy Vladimir Putin simply because it is incompatible with unlimited power. So the project of a special Russian civilization based on fundamentally different so-called traditional values was developed in order to justify the uncontrolled power and make it unlimited in time for long life. Deformation of the West and its values is implemented in the Russian society through an active propaganda against the LGBT community, which is supported by a special law. First, confrontation with the West and the outer world in general has to solve two domestic tasks. First, it strengthens the support for that part of Russian society which was disappointed by pro-Western but highly inefficient reforms of 90s. Second, basing on the mass-scale patriotic hysteria caused by the confrontation with the external enemy, is much easier to suppress the pro-Western opposition, which, according to the Kremlin, generates the main threat of the Orange Revolution. If international isolation is the price of a lifelong power, as shown by the experience of North Korea, Cuba, and some other countries, then why not pay this price? Especially if one can lose the power together with freedom and even life. Putin and his circle consider Ukraine, Belarus, and the Central Asia countries as the sphere of vital interests of their system of domination. The regime of Viktor Yanukovych met these interests. Therefore, its collapse was perceived as a challenge not only to the foreign policy interests, but the entire Putin's system. All that happened to Crimea and has been happening now to the eastern regions of Ukraine should be regarded as a response to this challenge. Putin demonstrates that he can beat Orange Revolution in its own territory, not to mention Russia. For him, Ukraine is a battlefield where he wants to destroy not only the new Kiev authorities, but also the West with its undermining Orange Revolution project. He wants to demonstrate to the world who the real master of the post-Soviet space is, while creating an imperial PR for himself and Russia, an image of the gatherer of the Russian lands. He openly declares that under his leadership, Russia will implement the imperial project of reunion of Russians throughout the whole of the former Soviet Union territory. What will happen next? I suppose the imperial project cannot be long-term, as it is fraught with enormous risks. Putin's system in general has a very small margin of stability, as it is based on extremely unfair distribution of property and national income. Russian economy is almost entirely dependent on global raw material prices. Now, external challenges are added to these internal sources of instability. Instead of solving its multiple problems, Russia will spend its oil revenues onto new territories and without any payoff, because a corrupt state is unable to develop even its old lands, not to mention the new ones. What should the West do? Sanctions are not a way out of the situation. They are double-edged. Western countries are unlikely to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of jobs that exist due to the supply of goods and equipment to Russia. In addition, Putin will use sanctions for provoking a new round of anti-Western hysteria and suppression of the opposition inside Russia. The main response of the West can be a kind of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. After the citizens of Russia will see that European integration has led to the improvement of life of Ukrainians, they sooner or later will realize that Putin is leading the country to a deadlock, and there is no real alternative to the European way of development of Russia in modern world. Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you, Sergey, and it's nice to hear someone from inside Russia standing up for LGBT rights, and you're very brave, and we applaud you. Now, we heard about Marshall plans and about the need for democracy, so we're very pleased to have Ken Wallach here from the NDI, who are very active on the ground in Kiev, and Ken's been spending a lot of time there. We've had delegations there, working with political parties. You'll be obviously have your opinions about sanctions as well, so perhaps you'd like to come up and tell us a little bit more about NDI's work in Ukraine and the American position.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that NDI has been very proud over the last 15 years with an office in Kiev and very talented group of expats and Ukrainian staff working with political parties, working with civic organizations, with the parliament, particularly with women within the parliament. We will be mounting a observation and monitoring effort for the upcoming elections. We are supporting groups of Ukrainian monitors who will be deployed throughout the country, thousands of them. We are supporting regional monitors under the aegis of the European Network of Election Monitors, and NDI will be organizing an international delegation itself. And as part of that effort, we 2 weeks ago sent a high-level delegation, a pre-election mission to Kiev, co-led by 3 individuals, 2 of whom are part of the Liberal family, former Canadian Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy and Matthias Orsay, a former Hungarian member of parliament, leader of the liberal group in the Council of Europe, and a former NDI staff person in Tripoli. And we will be working with political parties, particularly at the local level, for the upcoming election as well. So this will be a major effort in a very short period of time. The Ukrainian government faces the unenviable task of dealing with twin challenges in the country. The first, confronting a foreign power and non-state actors intent on carving up their country and leaving what is left ungovernable. And two, breaking with the past and for the first time responding to real citizen demands and expectations whose hopes were dashed almost 10 years ago when the promises of the Orange Revolution were not met. They will unlikely get a third chance to tackle issues like corruption, which is the #1 issue on the minds of Ukrainians, whether it is in the East, whether West or the South, and establish political institutions based on actual citizen participation. The Euromaidan, as Elisa talked about, fundamentally changed the political landscape in Ukraine. And perhaps more important, it represented a resurgence of civic pride, political engagement, and respect for honorable, and I emphasize honorable, public service. Most tangibly, it led to the collapse of a government, its replacement by a more reform-oriented and EU-focused interim government, and the scheduling of a snap presidential election. Less visibly, but more importantly, it shifted significant political power into the hands of citizens for the first time since the Orange Revolution. At the height of the demonstrations, political leaders answered not to oligarchs or patrons, but directly to activists on the Maidan. Moreover, Euromaidan mobilized hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians across the country into political activism. The tent city in Independence Square became an idealized microcosm of self-governance and volunteerism. These were major breakthroughs. That redistribution of power from elites to citizens will be sustainable, however, only if activists find post-Maidan ways to keep people engaged in politics. Street protests are blunt instruments for governing and cannot be prolonged indefinitely. It remains to be seen how effective this transition will be to more conventional forms of participation. Now, the motives of Vladimir Putin, I'm not qualified to talk about. Perhaps John Olderdice, a trained psychiatrist, would be better to speak on this subject. But Putin's aim has very little to do with Russian nationalism or even territorialism. Rather, it appears that he is trying to inoculate Russia from the pro-European and democratic tendencies that have taken hold in Ukraine. His prescription to inject instability, conflict, and uncertainty into the Ukrainian political situation and to damage the economy with the overriding aim of undermining the post-Maidan regime and forcing Ukraine back into Russia's orbit. Barring adequate resistance from Ukraine and the international community, he will keep ratcheting up the pressure until he reaches his goal. Further invasions and attempts of annexation cannot be ruled out. Also, the May 25th presidential election will be a tempting target for disruption. Paradoxically, it seems that the invasion of Crimea actually helped to consolidate a sense of shared Ukrainian identity and patriotism. Recent public opinion polls show overwhelming opposition to Russian actions in the West, the East, and the South, and support, overwhelming support for the May 26th election. That said, there are real fissures between East and West. These do not threaten the integrity of Ukraine in themselves, but the Russian government is trying to exploit and politicize the divisions, apparently with some success. One of the primary tools is media campaigns extolling Russia and condemning the quote-unquote fascist interim government in Kiev. Many are worried that these campaigns are drowning out alternative viewpoints in eastern and southern regions and will be effective in advancing these divisions. Ukrainians are quick to point out accurately that the Russian invasion has implications far beyond Ukraine. It represents an upheaval of the post-Cold War European security order and a threat to global nuclear nonproliferation. In nearly every meeting our delegation had and our office in Kiev, we are reminded that the U.S. was a signatory to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that offered security assurances to Ukraine in return for giving up its nuclear arsenal. In the long term, the internal challenge is for Ukraine to become a country that is less vulnerable to government failure and foreign manipulation in the future. Most of our partners seem to agree with this view, even if they found it hard, given the circumstances, to focus on long-term issues. The first test will be the May 25th elections. There will be 3 sets of elections: the presidential vote, one single mandate parliamentary race, and a series of local polls. More than 40 mayors, including Kiev, 27 settlement executives, 200 village executives, 2 city councils, including Kiev, and 3 village councils. Ukraine has proven that it can conduct genuine elections. Nationwide votes in 2004, 2006, 2007, and 2010 met international standards. According to credible domestic and international monitors, even though that these elections were followed by elections that failed, the legal framework for this election and the reforms that have already been adopted raise expectations that this process will be quite credible. But ways will have to be found by ensuring that those in the East, an overwhelming majority, as I said, who want to vote can vote, and even those in Crimea who want to cast ballots, and there will be a significant number, will be able to cross the border if they can to vote. As I said, these observer groups are in broad agreement that the amendments to the presidential election law brought the framework, the electoral framework, into compliance with international standards. The challenge will be to provide for maximum feasible participation. And I think this is a phrase we'll be hearing more about in the coming weeks. Maximum feasible participation, given the circumstances. This will be a situation most pronounced in the East that is somewhat similar to the situation we found most recently in Pakistan and Afghanistan, in a number of other places around the world, where the elections are not being disrupted by the political contestants themselves, but the elections are being disrupted, undermined, and thwarted by non-state actors, a new phenomenon in electoral behavior around the world. It is a time, I think, for collective action, not a word that liberals like all the time, but for collective action on the international stage. And I don't want to be too heretical here, but it may be a time for liberals, social democrats, conservatives, and Christian Democrats to unite in this cause. This body, along with the other political internationals, about 10 years ago adopted resolutions that said that under extraordinary circumstances, The four internationals should come together to speak with a common voice and to engage in democratic solidarity when democracy, human rights, liberty, and freedom is threatened. Well, what is taking place in Ukraine right now is justification for such type of unity. And I hope all of you and the other internationals would agree to come together in this type of solidarity. And it is not only Ukraine, because we can't forget that Moldova will be signing the association agreement on August 14th. They will be entering elections in November. And you will have, as an alternative to a coalition of social democrats, liberals, and Christian Democrats, the old Communist Party and Mr. Voronin. So this is an important opportunity, not only to confront aggression by a foreign power, but also to demonstrate solidarity and support for freedom and sovereignty in Ukraine, and the same for Moldova, because as it has been mentioned earlier, what is taking place now in Transnistria is also similar to what took place in Crimea. So this could very well spread unless that there is a united Europe, I believe leadership from the United States, and a convergence of interests among the great political ideologies, global political ideologies. So I hope that this will be an enormous call for action among the international communities, particularly over the course of the next month when so much is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Stirring words, and I've been assured we're going to have time for questions for the audience, so not quite yet, so just hold your horses. I think we heard there how important these elections are going to be on May the 25th, and Ken might be heartened to know that Liberal International have also been working with IDU, with the IRI. It's already happening on the ground. Everyone has the same focus, so it's definitely coming together like that. It's a big cause, and people are working together. So I think you'll bear with me for one last speaker, Vasily Miroshchenko, get his name right, from the Ukraine Crisis Media Center. And Vasily's been doing some very interesting work post-Maidan, and I think also he could tell us perhaps some of the changes that we're seeing in the way government is carried out in Ukraine already, with the interim government in expectation of a new government from May 25th.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. Firstly, I would like to thank Liberal International for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. I'm very happy to be here. I'm sort of a conference crasher because last minute, I was not on the program. I was very happy I could make it to this panel here. Well, firstly, just a couple of words about myself. I'm a businessman, but I'm also a political activist. I was involved into the anti-government protests since its inception on the 21st of November. Today, together with 5 or 6 other marketing PR firms, we have set up a Ukraine Crisis Media Center. We set it up over pretty much in 48 hours after the invasion of Crimea by the Russian forces. And the goal is very simple. We want to counteract massive Russian propaganda in the world. We want to provide objective information about Ukrainian government and actually how the Ukrainian government is addressing various issues in Ukraine. But now actually a little bit about stepping back. So what was Maidan? Maidan was a revolution of dignity. Maidan, we started under the banner of the EU flags, and there was not a single revolution on this continent. We started under the banner of the EU. Has actually turned out to be a revolution against corruption, endemic corruption in Ukraine. The ousted President Yanukovych has allegedly embezzled $70 billion. You must have seen the pictures of his mansion. It is a disgust. What is Maidan? Maidan is a Mecca. Maidan is a place where Ukrainians from all corners of Ukraine, from all walks of life, keep coming after 6 or 8 weeks after the tragic death of many people. People come there on a pilgrimage, and it's a search of spiritual So basically, Maidan has changed the society. People at Maidan were craving for rule of law, for their rights to be protected, for human rights, and they were actually fighting for a proper society which functions. So what's now? What do we have now? We have, in fact, the best government we ever had. I'll just give you some of the examples. Our Minister of Economy was educated at Emory University in America. He's got an MBA. He set up the best business school in Ukraine. He advised Malaysian government. Who's the new head of tax service, the most corrupt agency in Ukraine? This guy was educated in the United Kingdom. He worked for the UBS, an investment bank, and now he's the head of the tax service. Who is the new head of customs, another the most corrupt agency in Ukraine? This is a guy who was to be a partner at KPMG, a Big Four company. Our society and our government is all-inclusive. The Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine is Mr. Groisman, who is the mayor of Vinica. He's from the Jewish community. The governor of Dnipropetrovsk is Mr. Kolomoisky, one of the leaders of the Jewish European Union. The president of the public TV company of Ukraine is a Georgian man. The first man who was killed at Maidan was Armenian. So what is Russia doing? Russia is attacking Ukraine. They've used all possible means of modern warfare. They've used economic, financial, military, and they use information as a warfare. We have 1984 in 2014. The level of Russian propaganda is enormous. They're using World War II rhetoric to depict Ukrainian government as fascist. The only problem is that Mr. Putin is actually reminiscent of Mr. Hitler himself. I shouldn't call him a Mr. though. The problem is, Russian government is doling out millions and millions of dollars to bribe journalists, to bribe political parties. Gazprom people in London walk around to talk to investment banks, hedge funds, and private equity funds, telling them that Ukraine is a failed state. What is that? I'm very happy that liberal parties were not recipients of this money. However, there are many parties in Europe which have received money donations from the Russian oligarchs. So what can we do now? I think it has to stop. I think the security of Europe is under threat. Russia can actually invade Ukraine, eastern part of Ukraine, any minute. It's serious. Actually, around May 9th, which is a very symbolic day for all Ukrainians, and actually post-Soviet world, he can actually take over Ukraine. And the reaction of the world was very subtle. I mean, what is that? The sanctions are not enough. I have to admit, I appreciate the comments of Yabloko here, but look, two brothers of my grandfather live in Volgograd, in Russia. But I believe that all Russians have to suffer. The problem is, I think that the more they suffer, the more they realize that Putin has betrayed them, the sooner he will be toppled. And of course, the biggest threat for Putin is actually strong and prosperous Ukraine. So Marshall Plan for Ukraine is a must. I believe that there is no time, and the business interests, I think this is a very important question, because I think that was the same debate here in the Netherlands as it was a debate in Germany and some other countries, and Italy for the matter of fact. I think we should sacrifice the business interests, because I think that today, by saving the interests of your businesses, you're actually sacrificing the prosperity and stability and security in Europe. Thank you.
So some impassioned words there. Thank you very much, Vasily, and another point of view. There's been so much that we've heard from our speakers on the panel here, and there'll be a lot that the audience want to ask. Can I ask people in the audience, given our time, to keep questions very simple, not to statements, and we'll try and find the best answers for you from the panel. So, I'm going to ask, and can you say who you are when you get the microphone, please? Yes.
I'm Rudi Rentschler from the German FDP, and I'm the secretary of the Liberal Group in the OECD Parliamentary Assembly. Is it correct that Putin has a great interest to avoid the elections in the Ukraine, and he can do this by invasion? And is it correct that good countermeasures would to announce sanctions against this? And if we want lighter a prosperous Ukraine? Is it true that money is needed, money against reforms, but without money, Ukraine would become bankrupt? Thanks.
Who would like to answer that question? Yes? Please, Ambassador.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the question. The question is very relevant. First, I would like to add one more factor why Putin moved now to Ukraine. And it deals to some extent with your question. Shell has started exploration of tied-up gas in Ukraine. And today, it is supposed that 22 trillion cubic meters of gas is in the region. As soon as Ukraine becomes energy independent, and as soon as we are getting the cheaper gas for Europe, Russian gas will be not used at all, and as a result, being based on the economy. So, your question. I think that Ukraine is not asking for money. Ukraine is asking for support, money for exchange of several things. First, economic stability, and then Ukraine, and it's my very serious conviction that Ukraine is not a liability for Europe, it's an asset. Couple of examples. For example, foodstuff security. Ukraine can double production of grain up to 120 million, and it will make possible to mitigate the consequences of even illegal migration from some regions by sending the food there and to resolve the issue on a spot. Then, believe it or not, but after some years, people will understand that the nuclear power is the cheapest one and the most effective and the safest and the cleanest. Believe me, we have survived syndrome, Chernobyl syndrome, we know it on a spot, and this is a real issue. And in a couple of years, this will be back. And Ukraine is the third largest deposit of uranium on the territory in the world. The cheapest. You don't need to get it in Australia, but you can come to Europe and get it.
Just to,
Yeah,
go ahead. If I may, just wanted to add on the financial assistance and support to Ukraine. Of course, macroeconomic stability is very important. As we speak here, IMF deal is being negotiated. We very much appreciate the support of the United States in this respect. However, what we really need is something very specific. Apart from the financial bailout, we really need the assistance of the government of the actually EU and various other countries to, for instance, curb corruption. This is a big issue in Ukraine. We need technical assistance on that. The another thing is export promotion. For instance, we're here in the Netherlands, and Holland is one of the best traders in the world. So we need support of Holland to help Ukrainian exporters find new markets. We need technical skills, and among other things. I see many questions, so I'm going to stop here. Let's take questions, and then we can answer more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take 3 quick questions, so if you could just ask yours quickly, and we'll go.
My question is, what measures of the West could hurt Putin? In other words, which measures would be effective? And to me, I think the economic situation is the most important. When the ruble goes down, when the stock market in Moscow goes down, the Russian economy basically is weak. That is the only chance we have that Putin might see reason.
Han, would you like to come back on that one? Economic sanctions against Putin, can they really have an effect?
I think they're having an effect already, but the pain threshold for Putin, as I just said, is much higher than ours. Real sanctions would, of course, what we call now phase 3 or stage 3, when you single out certain key interest industries. Let's just say, for example, if Rosneft, a company like Rosneft, would be targeted with sanctions, that would, I guess, hurt. But it would trigger an immediate response that would hurt us too. To be quite honest, I don't feel that the ruble in itself or going down of the stock market is that essential. What is essential is that capital flows out. Companies now are not capable of relying on their working capital anymore. They cannot reinsure their loans, and that will hurt over time. The question is, how much time do they have, and how much time and how much resources are we willing to sacrifice? And I'm afraid that our ability to sacrifice with just this amount of economic recovery at this very moment is going to be a very tough call.
I would like to add, you see, if you need a specific answer, I have a measure, but it will need the solidarity of all EU countries. Simply to suggest that gas will be bought from Russia on Ukrainian-Russian border. That's it. It will immediately make the price of gas for Ukraine the same as for Europe, and it will not be possible to make a political price for Ukraine. And the second, in transit of gas, we can negotiate these economic issues which will need, for example, the money which you want to give to Ukraine for the reforms. It can be done through the different kind of cost of transit from one country to another country and so. So this is the most specific which I can suggest you now.
Han, you just want to come back?
Can I just add one sentence to that on the gas? We all know that there's national regulations that prohibit the Americans from exporting their LNG outside of their own country. It's always been a protective measure for their chemical industry, keeping their gas prices down and our gas prices up, the world market gas prices up. We've actually been, it was very good for the Dutch. We're an gas exporter still ourselves. What would be good, and I think there is increasing pressure also from lawmakers in Washington at the moment, because all of a sudden exporting LNG, which is what they are capable of doing, there's a national interest argument and a security and stability argument to do this. And if we would all put pressure on that together, it would solve a couple of things in one go. If they would start exporting the LNG, there is European countries like ours who are capable of handling those, also reshipping it back to Ukraine, which is what we're trying to do at the moment already, combined with the fact that we're going into the summer and that we have enormous strategic reserves. Within a year, the situation could be quite different from now. And I think this is a more positive measure that we could take. It's not a sanction, it's actually being clever.
On this very important issue, would you like to put the American side on that, or you're happy with that?
We'll take more questions.
We'll take some more questions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Dorin Dusiak. I'm Vice President of the Liberal Reformist Party from the Republic of Moldova. And I would like to address my question to Mr. Kenneth Wallach. As you have very well mentioned it, the situation, the things that are going now in the Ukraine may have a very bad influence on the Transnistria. And we may see in the future the repeating of the Ukrainian scenario in the Republic of Moldova. Well, we in Moldova managed to somehow avoid the Ukrainian scenario because on Monday the Moldovan citizens will start to circulate freely in the European Union, and soon we will sign the association agreement with the European Union. Last week, a small but very important revolution happened in the European Parliament, who for the first time recognized a European perspective for the Republic of Moldova. So my question would be, what do you think should our country specifically do? What would be the concrete steps after this recognition of the European perspective in order for, after the signing of the association agreement, for the European integration to become a very quick and foreseeable result of this entire process? Thank you.
We're going to take a couple more questions on top of that one. This gentleman at the back, please. Do you need a microphone? Okay.
Oh, okay, fine. Hello, thank you. I'm Sean O'Kernin, Secretary General of the Liberal Group in the Committee of the Regions. For those who don't know, Committee of the Regions is the European Union institution that represents subnational government. And this is relevant because just earlier this month, the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine was at our plenary session, and he officially, formally requested assistance from the Committee of the Regions and advice to help with the implementation of decentralization. Now, we've heard about the need for a Marshall Plan. That is probably true, but there's probably also a need for an institutional Marshall Plan, if you wish. My question is for Ambassador Horan. There are many ways of decentralizing. Could you give us some indication as to how that is being thought through, what different ideas or models of decentralization are currently taking place? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good question. So we're going to take one more question, and then we're going to get those answered. This gentleman here, please.
Kasit, Democrat Party of Thailand. I think there are two things. The first one is the democratization process in Ukraine, which all of us have to help and then work in order to ensure that democracy doesn't turn illiberal. But the second one, I think a question in particular to you, Ambassador, since Ukraine is sandwiched between the desire to be with part of the whole Europe, Western Europe, join the EU, but at the same time you have the practical reality of the Russian influence. Have you been thinking of making Ukraine a sort of a neutral Switzerland or whatever, so that you can have both worlds? And I think peace would be coming instead of having this a sort of a more confrontational posture by both sides. Thank you.
So, Ambassador, decentralized Switzerland, is that the future for Ukraine?
Frankly speaking, it's not a question for the ambassador, but since it was addressed to me, I will try to reply. First of all, as far as the issue of decentralization is concerned, we understand that decentralization, first of all, means more authority for local powers, for local authorities to use, first of all, what? Money, their revenues they're getting from it. So it is redistribution, first of all, and the change in the formation of the budget of the state. So to make it less center-oriented with the redistribution functions into the possibility for the regions to use their own resources for the development of regions, so forth, so on.
And external assistance in this process will probably be welcome, I would imagine.
The external assistance is necessary, is a technical assistance to make people to understand how it works, how it is needed to act, and I think all assistance will be welcome, because sometimes we are trying to get assistance in one sphere, and it occurs that we are getting very good advice in different spheres, which is very good.
And very quickly, can you face to Russia and Europe? Can you do both?
You see, I like to quote Porfirio Diaz, Mexican president of 1907, who once said, "Poor Mexico is too far from God and too close to the United States of America." So in the case of Mexico, they were in much better position because the United States of America were moving toward democracy and developed democracy in the country. Unfortunately, our neighboring state is moving to totalitarianism, you see. So that is why it seems to me the issue of the relationship it's a more political issue. And I would like to ask your attention to one very interesting moment. Have you heard about the movement of miners or pit workers today in Lugansk, in Donetsk, in the region of miners, the largest part of the population? You will not find them there, and they have voiced their position that they do not want to get out of Ukraine at all. No. Why? Because it's quite understandable that for Russia, this is destabilization exercise and not the exercise in order to make people live better. This is one thing. Second thing, what is done in the region when they compare, they say, okay, Maidan, you have started the process, we didn't start the fire, and so forth, so on. But On Maidan, there were no little green men equipped with Russian uniform, insignia, without insignia, and with Russian-made arms. So what has occurred now in the East is first coming spec-op detachments, then those who support the idea, and then the voicing of Foreign Minister of Lavrov, who is saying that we should prevent to fight against the civil population. But if I'm not mistaken, it was Mr. Putin who at his first press conference said, do Ukrainians think that they are going to fight with us? No, they are going to fight with children and women who are going to be in front of our army that is following it. What is this? I'm speaking as a citizen, not as an ambassador. This is fascism. Fascism in its very clear way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I very much really want to finish there. Would you just say one quick word about Moldova and the good news about Moldova and what that means for the Western community?
Challenging time for Moldova. I don't want to be presumptuous here, but I think I'm not telling you anything you don't know. All the public opinion polls and the focus groups that NDI has done in Moldova shows that the population is split almost 50-50 on the east versus the west. Secondly, what the polling shows is that people do not know the benefits of European integration. So I think that there is a clear message to the parties between now and November. And the message is, number one, and it's no secret that the parties are not, the coalition is not in love with each other, the party members of the coalition. Whether you run separately or you run together for the upcoming elections, there has to be, whatever differences there exist, and they're considerable, personal and political, those have to be put aside. Secondly, I think a real grassroots effort has to be made over the course of the next several months to explain the benefits of Europe to a population that is unaware of it and a population that is split on those issues. So I think these challenges, I think, can be overcome. They've been overcome in the past, but you have to assume that outside actors are going to try to influence this process as well. And so there requires a call to action for all the coalition members.
Thank you for that, Ken. And that's a lesson that Ukraine may need to learn for the future, we hope, when things are calmer. Thank you very much to the panel. Well, would you want to finish with something?
I wanted to answer the question about sanctions against Russia. I don't think that consequent sanctions are possible at all because of interests of Western business. Secondly, we have some other countries like China and so on, and they probably will not join to those sanctions. And third, what I could say, there is one more response by Putin for strict sanctions. It is a totalitarian economy of Stalinist type. What is Russia's economy without the West and international community? It is economy of Stalinist type, and our officials already said about it. Medvedev said about it two days before on the sitting of the State Duma.
I'm going to get in trouble for this.
Yeah, just very briefly. Of course, the lifting the ban on the supply of gas from the U.S. We really need to cast trap on Russia, and that's the most important thing. And I think senators and congressmen right now understand it. The ban is going to be lifted. We need to to contribute to the energy security of the Central European states, which solely depend on Russia. That's very important. Secondly, you have to understand that Crimea was a land-grabbing operation. Apart from grabbing land in Crimea, Putin has actually grabbed oil and gas reserves in the Black Sea Shelf. ExxonMobil was just about to sign a deal which didn't happen because Putin took over Crimea. So now all these energy companies like ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, invested into the Russian energy market should understand that they are supporting Russian aggression in Ukraine. And what I'm really thankful to Vladimir Putin, and I'm going to finish here. Please. I'm very thankful to Vladimir Putin for uniting the Ukrainian nation. You have to understand, we now have ethnic Russians in Ukraine who totally hate Putin. It never was before. It was never like that. Thank you, Vladimir Putin.
So thanks to Vladimir Putin. Thanks to the panel and to our organizers, the European Liberal Forum and to Liberal International, and very sorry for running over time, and thanks to the audience for participating, and sorry for any questions that weren't answered. I hope you enjoyed that panel. Thank you.